Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Mountains of the Mind, Adventures in Reaching the Summit, by Robert MacFarlane, narrated by James Gillies. Oh, the mind! Mind has mountains. Gerard Manley Hopkins, circa 1880. 1. Possession. I thought of the resistless passion which drives men to undertake terrific scrambles. No example can deter them. A peak can exercise the same irresistible power of attraction as an abyss. Théophile Gautier, 1868. I was a 12-year-old in my grandparents' house in the Scottish Highlands when I first came across one of the great stories of mountaineering, The Fight for Everest, an account of the 1924 British expedition during which George Mallory and Andrew Irvine disappeared near the summit of Everest. We were staying in the house for the summer. My brother and I were allowed to go anywhere except into the room at the end of the hallway, which was my grandfather's study. We played hide-and-seek, and I often hid in the big wardrobe in our bedroom. It smelt strongly of camphor, and there was a clutter of shoes on the floor of the wardrobe, which made it difficult to stand up in. My grandmother's fur coat hung in it too, sheathed in thin, clear plastic to keep the moths away. It was strange to put a hand out to touch the soft fur and feel the smooth plastic instead. The best room in the house was the conservatory, which my grandparents called the sun-room. Its floor was paved with grey flagstones, always cold underfoot, and two of its walls were giant windows. On one of the windows my grandparents had stuck a black card cut-out in the shape of a hawk. It was supposed to scare away small birds, but they regularly flew into the windows and killed themselves, thinking that the glass was air. Even though it was summer, the inside of the house was filled with the cold mineral air of the highlands, and every surface was always chilly to the touch. When we ate dinner, the chunky silver pieces of cutlery which came out of the dresser were cold in our hands. At night, when we went to bed, the sheets were icy. I would wriggle as far down the bed as I could go, and hold the top sheet down over my head to create an airlock. Then I would breathe as deeply as I could until I had warmed up the bed. There were books everywhere in the house. My grandfather had not tried to organize them, and so very different books found themselves neighbors. On a small shelf in the dining-room, Mr. Crabtree Goes Fishing, The Hobbit, and the Fireside Omnibus of detective stories shared space with two leather-bound volumes of J.S. Mill's System of Logic. There were several books about Russia whose titles I did not properly understand, and dozens about exploration and mountaineering. One night, unable to sleep, I came downstairs for something to read. Against one side of the hallway was a long pile of books lying stacked on their sides. Almost at random, I pulled a big green volume out from halfway down the pile, like a brick from a wall, and carried it to the sun-room. In the bright moonlight, I sat on one of the wide stone window ledges and started to read The Fight for Everest. I already knew some of the details from my grandfather, who had told me the story of the expedition. But the book, with its long descriptions, its 24 black-and-white photographs, and its fold-out maps bearing unfamiliar place names, the Far East Rongbuk Glacier, the Dzong Pen of Shakar, the Lakpa La, was far more potent than his account. As I read, I was carried out of myself and to the Himalaya. The images rushed over me. I could see the gravel plains of Tibet scrolling away to distant white peaks, Everest itself like a dark pyramid, the oxygen bottles the climbers wore on their backs, and which made them look like scuba divers, the massive ice walls on the North Col, which they scaled using ropes and ladders, like medieval warriors besieging a city, and finally the black tea of sleeping bags, which was laid out on the snow at Camp 6 to tell the climbers at the lower camps, who were staring up at the mountain's higher slopes through telescopes, that Mallory and Irvine had disappeared. One passage of the book excited me more than any other. It was the description by Noel Odell, the expedition's geologist, of his last sighting of Mallory and Irvine. There was a sudden clearing of the atmosphere above me, and I saw the whole summit ridge and final peak of Everest unveiled. I noticed far away on a snow slope leading up to what seemed to me to be the last step but one from the base of the final pyramid, a tiny object moving and approaching the rock step. A second object followed, and then the first climbed to the top of the step. As I stood intently watching this dramatic appearance, the scene became enveloped in cloud. Over and over I read that passage, and I wanted nothing more than to be one of those two tiny dots, fighting for survival in the thin air. That was it. I was sold on adventure. In one of the reading binges which only the expanses of childhood time permit, I plundered my grandfather's library, and by the end of that summer I had read a dozen or so of the most famous real-life exploration stories from the mountains and the poles, including Apsley Cherry Garrard's tale of Antarctic endurance, The Worst Journey in the World, John Hunt's The Ascent of Everest, and Edward Whymper's bloody account of his scrambles amongst the Alps. The childish imagination has more trust in the transparency of a story than the adult imagination, a readier faith that things happen the way they are said to have done. It is more powerful in its capacity for sympathy, too, and as I read those books I lived intensely with and through the explorers. I spent evenings with them in their tents, thawing pemmican hoosh over a seal blubber stove as the wind skirled outside. I sledge-hauled through thigh-deep polar snow. I bumped over sastrugi, tumbled down gullies, clambered up arêtes, and strode along ridges. From the summits of mountains I surveyed the world as though it were a map. 10 times or more I nearly died. I was fascinated by the hardships these men, for they were almost all men, faced and endured. At the poles there was cold intense enough to freeze brandy solid, to freeze dogs' tongues to their coats so they tried to lick them, and to freeze men's beards to their jackets if they looked down. Woolen clothing stiffened to the rigidity of sheet metal and had to be beaten with hammers to make it bend. At night the explorers melted their way, inch by agonizing inch, into their reindeer hair sleeping bags, which the cold had hardened into icy scabbards. In the mountains there were the cornices that overhung cliff edges like horizontal waves, the invisible attacks of altitude, and avalanches and blizzards which could whitewash the world in an instant. Except for Hilary and Tenzing's successful ascent of Everest in 1953, and Ernest Shackleton's salvation of his entire crew in 1916, Worsley's miraculous navigation, the little James Caird steering its impeccable line across 800 miles of stormy Southern Ocean, Shackleton remaining imperturbable, while above him Europe fractured like pack ice. Almost all of these stories resulted in death, or mutilation of some sort. I liked the grisly details. In some of the polar stories barely a page went by without the loss of a crew member or a body part. Occasionally crew member meant body part. Scurvy ravaged the explorers as well, destabilizing the flesh so that it fell from bones like wet biscuit. One man was so badly afflicted that blood seeped from pores all over his body. There was also something about the setting of these stories, the stages on which they took place, which stirred me profoundly. I was attracted by the bleakness of the places these men got to, the parsimony of the landscapes of mountain and pole, with their austere Manichaean colour scheme of black and white. The human values in the stories were polarized too, bravery and cowardice, rest and exertion, danger and safety, right and wrong. The unforgiving nature of the environment sorted everything into these neat binaries. I wanted my life to be this clear in its lines, this simple in its priorities. I came to love them, these men, the polar explorers with their sledges, their songs, and their soft spot for penguins, and the mountaineers with their pipes, their insouciance, and their unfeasible stamina. I loved how inconsistent, their rough appearance, their indestructible tweed breeches, their bristling mutton chops and moustaches, the silk and the bear grease with which they insulated themselves against the cold, seemed to be, with their almost fastidious sensitivity to the beauties of the landscapes they moved in. Then there was the combination of aristocratic finickiness, the 60 tins of quail and foie gras, the bow ties and the vintage Montebello champagne that were carried on the 1924 Everest expedition, for example, with enormous hardihood, and their acceptance that a violent death was, if not probable, certainly very possible. They seemed to me then the ideal travellers, unfazed by adversity and unassuming in person. I longed to be like them. I longed in particular for the thermostat of little Birdie Bowers, Scott's right-hand man, who, during the voyage south on the Terra Nova, washed on deck every morning in a bucket of sea-water, and who was able to sleep, in temperatures down to -30°C. Above all, I was drawn to those men who travelled to climb the high peaks of the greater ranges. So many of them died. I learned the roll call by heart. Mallory and Irvine on Everest, Mummery and Nanga Parbat, Donkin and Fox and Coshton Tau. The list went on and on through the ranks of the less familiar. The imaginative light the mountaineers cast over me was like that cast by the polar expeditions. The beauty and danger of the landscape, the immensities of space, the utter uselessness of it all. But with high altitudes in place of high latitudes. To be sure, these people had their faults. They were beset by the sins of their age, racism, sexism, and an unflagging snobbery, and mingled with their bravery was an acute selfishness. But I didn't notice these traits at the time. All I saw was impossibly brave men stepping out into the brilliant light of the unknown. The book which undoubtedly made the deepest impression on me was Maurice Herzog's Annapurna, dictated by Herzog from a hospital bed in 1951. He couldn't write it himself because he had no fingers left. Herzog was the leader of a team of French mountaineers which, in the spring of 1950, travelled to the Nepal Himalaya with the aim of being the first group to summit one of the world's 14 8,000-metre peaks. After an arduous month of reconnaissance, and with time running out before the arrival of the monsoon, the French team made their way into the heart of the Annapurna Range, a lost world of ice and rock, locked off by a ring of the highest mountains on earth. We were in a savage and desolate cirque of mountains never before seen by man, wrote Herzog. No animal or plant could exist here. In the pure morning light, this absence of all life, this utter destitution of nature, seemed only to intensify our own strength. How could we expect anyone else to understand the peculiar exhilaration that we drew from this barrenness, when man's natural tendency is to turn towards everything in nature that is rich and generous? Gradually the team moved up the mountain, establishing successively higher camps. The altitude, the extreme cold, and the load-bearing began to take their toll. But as Herzog grew physically weaker, so his conviction strengthened that the summit was attainable. Eventually, on 3rd June, he and a climber called Louis Lachenal left Camp 5, the highest camp, in a bid for the top of Annapurna. This final stage of the mountain involved the ascent of a long, curving ramp of ice the team had nicknamed the Sickle Glacier, and then of a steep band of rock which protected the summit itself. Aside from this band, the route offered nothing serious in the way of technical obstacles, and keen to save weight, Lachenal and Herzog left their rope behind them. The weather was immaculate when they departed Camp 5, with a pristine sky. Clear skies bring the lowest temperatures, though, and the air was so cold that both men felt their feet freezing inside their boots as they climbed higher. Quite soon it became apparent that they would have to turn back or run the risk of severe frostbite. They carried on. In his account of the climb, Herzog describes becoming progressively more detached from what was happening to him. The clarity and thinness of the air, the crystalline beauty of the mountains, and the strange painlessness of frostbite conspired to send him into a state of numbed serenity, which made him insensitive to his worsening injuries. There was something unusual in the way I saw La Chanelle and everything around us. I smiled to myself at the paltriness of our efforts, but all sense of exertion was gone, as though there were no longer any gravity. This diaphanous landscape, this quintessence of purity, these were not the mountains I knew. They were the mountains of my dreams. Still in this trance, still immune to pain, he and La Chanelle forced a way through the final rock band and reached the summit. I felt my feet freezing, but paid little attention. The highest mountain to be climbed by man lay under our feet. The names of our predecessors on these heights chased each other through my mind. Mummery, Mallory and Irvin, Bauer, Welzenbach, Tillman, Shipton. How many of them were dead? How many had found on these mountains what to them was the finest end of all? I knew the end was near, but it was the end that all mountaineers wish for, an end in keeping with their ruling passion. I was consciously grateful to the mountains for being so beautiful for me that day, and as awed by their silence as if I had been in church. I was in no pain, and had no worry. The pain and the worry came later. While descending the rock band, Herzog dropped his gloves, and by the time he reached Camp 4, he was barely able to walk. Both his feet and his hands were severely frostbitten. During the desperate retreat down steep ground to base camp, he fell and smashed several bones in his already devastated feet. When he was forced to abseil, the ropes ripped away the flesh of his hands in thick strips. Once the terrain became less precipitous, it was possible for Herzog to be carried, and he was portaged off the mountain, first by piggyback, then in a basket, then on a sledge, and finally on a stretcher. During the retreat his feet and hands were wrapped and bagged in plastic to save them from further harm. When they reached camp each night, Udo, the expedition doctor, injected Novocaine, spartocamphor and penicillin into Herzog's femoral and brachial arteries, pushing the long needle in through the left and right flanks of his groin and the bends of his elbows, an experience so painful that Herzog begged for death in preference. By the time he was off the mountain, Herzog's feet had turned black and brown. By the time they reached the safety of Gorakhpur, Udo had amputated almost all of his toes and fingers. I read Annapurna 3 times that summer. It was obvious to me that Herzog had chosen wisely in going for the top, despite the subsequent costs. For what he and I were agreed were toes and fingers, compared to having stood on those few square yards of snow. If he had died, it would still have been worth it. This was the lesson I took away from Herzog's book, that the finest end of all was to be had on a mountain top. From death in valleys preserve me, O Lord. 12 years after I first read Annapurna, 12 years during which I had spent most of my holidays in the mountains, running my finger along the spines in a second-hand bookshop in Scotland, I came across another copy. That night I sat up late and read it through again, and again fell under its spell. Soon afterwards I booked flights and a climbing partner, an army friend of mine called Toby Till, for a week in the Alps. We arrived in Zermatt in early June, hoping to climb the Matterhorn before the summer crowds clogged it up. but the mountain was still thickly armoured with ice, too dangerous for us to attempt. So we drove round to the next valley, where the thaw was supposed to be a little more advanced. Our plan was to camp high overnight, and then the following morning ascend a mountain called the Laginhorn by its easy southeast ridge. At 4,010 metres, I reflected briefly, the Laginhorn was almost exactly half the height of Annapurna. It snowed that night, and I lay awake listening to the heavy flakes falling onto the fly-sheet of our tent. They clumped together to make dark continents of shadow in the fabric, until the drifts became too heavy for the slope of the tent, and slid with a soft hiss down to the ground. In the small hours the snow stopped, but when we unzipped the tent door at 6 a.m., there was an ominous yellowish storm light drizzling through the clouds. We set off apprehensively towards the ridge. Once we were on it, the ridge turned out to be harder than it looked from below. The difficulty came from the old, rotten snow, which was cloaking the ridge to a depth of several feet, together with 6 inches of fresh fall lying on top of it, uncompacted and sticky. Rotten snow is either granular, like sugar, or forms a crunchy matrix of longer, thinner crystals, which have been hollowed out and separated from one another. Either way, it is unstable. Instead of picking our way cleanly from rock to rock, we had to clamber along the snow, never sure if there was a rock beneath each foot placement, or air. There was no path broken to guide us either. Evidently nobody had been up the ridge since the previous summer. And it was cold, too. Violently cold. Where my nose ran, the liquid froze to my face in plump trails. The wind made my eyes water, and the eyelashes on my right eye froze together. I had to separate them by pulling my eyelids apart. After 2 hours of work we were nearing the summit, but the angle of the ridge was becoming more severe, and our progress had become even slower. I could feel the cold chilling me deep inside. My brain, too, felt slower, more slurred, as though the temperature had congealed my thought processes, turned them viscous. We could have turned back, of course. We carried on. The final 50 feet of the mountain were very steep indeed, and deep in old unsound snow. I stopped and assessed the situation. It looked as though the mountain could shuck all the snow off at any moment, like shrugging off a coat. Now and again little avalanches scurried past me. I heard the clatter of a rock fall on the east face of the mountain. I was jammed into the snow, with the toes of my boots, the slope rearing up in front of my face. I tilted my head right backwards and looked up to the skyline. Clouds were hurtling over the summit, and for a moment it felt as though the mountain was toppling slowly onto me. I turned back and called down to Toby, 20 feet below me. "Do it go on? I don't like the look of this stuff at all. I reckon the whole lot could go at any time." Below Toby the slope narrowed down to a chute which funneled out over the precipices on the south face of the ridge. If I slipped, or the snow gave way, I'd slide past Toby, pull him off, and we'd free-fall hundreds of feet down to the glacier. "Of course we do, Rob, of course we do," Toby called up. "Right." I had only one ice axe with me, but the slope was severe enough to need 2. Some improvisation was necessary. I transferred the axe to my left hand and made the fingers of my right hand as rigid as possible. I would try to stab them into the snow, using them as an axe-head to give myself purchase. Nervously, I started to climb. The snow held. The ad hoc axe worked, and suddenly we were there, on a summit the size of a kitchen table, clasping the iron piping cross which peeked out of the thick snow on the summit, terrified and elated at once. To every side of us the mountain fell away. It felt as though we were balanced on the pinnacle of the Eiffel Tower. The clouds had cleared, and a glossy white light had replaced the murk of the early morning. I spotted the yellow dot of our tent, thousands of feet below. Seen from this height, the glacier which we had crossed the previous day to reach the base of the ridge resolved itself into a pattern of shallow, pale billows. I could see dozens of tiny melt-water lakes which had formed in the hollows between the billows, winking at me like shields in the sun. Their blueness was startling. To our west, the light of the rising sun poured down the mountain faces of the Michable range. The wind was fierce, drumming against the skin of my cheeks until it was numb, and pushing coldly through the gaps in my clothing. I looked down at my hands. I had been wearing thin gloves all the way up, and from jabbing them into the ice slope, 3 fingertips on the right-hand glove had been ripped off. I couldn't feel those fingers. In fact, I realized, with a strange lack of alarm, I couldn't feel the hand at all. I held it up close to my streaming eyes. The fingertips, which were exposed to the freezing air, had turned a waxy yellow colour and become translucent, like old cheese. I didn't have any spare gloves, but there wasn't time to worry about it anyway, because the rotten snow, which had just about tolerated our weight during the ascent, would already be melting in the morning sun. We needed to get down as fast as possible. We moved quickly and efficiently during the descent, until we reached what looked like our final obstacle. It was a snow bridge, a thin, sagging ridge of snow, maybe 30 feet long, suspended between 2 rock pinnacles, like a sheet pegged up at either end. It was far too sharp and fragile to walk along the top of, and there was no way to climb down and round it. We'd have to climb out along its side, as we had done on the way up, with even less guarantee that the whole structure wouldn't collapse and send us plummeting down to the glacier. Toby began to kick himself a little bucket seat in the soft snow. "I take it from your behaviour that you'd like me to go first?" I asked. "Yes, please, that'd be grand." I edged out along the near vertical side of the ridge, kicking my feet into its side, the rope bowing horizontally between me and Toby. Where I kicked my feet in, the snow slid away like wet sugar, with a hiss. Here I am, I thought, standing in a more or less vertical wall of slushy snow, edging crabwise across its face, with frost-nip in 3 fingers and only 1 axe. I cursed Maurice Herzog. Then I glanced down. Between my legs, I could see a whole lot of nothing. I kicked another crampon in, and a big slab of rotten snow lurched off from beneath my foot and cartwheeled away towards the glacier, disintegrating as it went. I hung there, my arms raised above me, watching the snow tumble. A tingling began in my buttocks, and then scampered to my groin and my thighs, and soon my whole midriff was encased in a humming, jostling swarm of fear. The space felt vast and malevolently active, as though it were inhaling me, pulling me off into its emptiness. 1 axe only. Why did I bring only 1? Again I used my right hand, the hand with the waxy fingers, to stab into the snow. The fingers didn't hurt, which helped, and so I carried on, keeping up a rhythm. Kick, kick, stab, stab, swear. Kick, kick, stab, stab, swear. We made it, of course. I wouldn't be writing this otherwise. And as we sledged down the remaining slopes to our tent, on our rucksacks, we whooped with joy and relief at having got the summit, and made it back. Sitting on a boulder, outside the tent 2 hours later, I stared at my fingers with a fatigued disinterest. It had turned into a bright day, warm and windless, and the landscape was illuminated with the exact egalitarian sunlight of high places. Sound carried precisely through the thin air, and I could hear the clanking and talking of climbers descending the Weissmies, 1/2 a mile or so away. My right hand didn't particularly feel like part of me, but I was vaguely relieved to notice only the pads of 3 fingers were affected, and those not to any serious depth. When I tapped them against the rock, they made a hard, hollow sound, like wood knocking on metal. I got out my penknife and started to whittle at them. On the flat grey rock between my knees grew a pile of little iotas of skin. Eventually, when I had whittled down to pink skin, and my fingers had started to hurt at each scrape of the knife—
Sample complete. Ready to continue?